Good evening, tributes. Welcome back to Tales of the Hunger Games. I hope you're all well. Before we proceed with the video, I'd like to let you know that I'll be discussing some of last week's questions and comments at the end of this video, so feel free to stick around after the victor is crowned, where we'll be having a look at what some people have said. I'd also like to give a shout out to Alexis Lader, who has made a full album of 14 songs that are based on the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and I've attached the link in the description and pinned comment, so feel free to give it a listen as well. Also, I'm going to be giving the usual honourable mention to Andrew McLean for making all the art that's featured in this episode and the one before. Once again, it's really appreciated, and I suggest checking out his link that will also be attached in the description and pinned comment. Whilst you're in the description, feel free to check out any of the other links associated with Tales of the Hunger Games. And just a quick warning, the victor for this year's games will not be revealed until the end, so beware of going into the comments sections, as there might well be some spoilers there. So without further ado, I warn you that literary gore is about to follow. Let's begin. Even after 23 of the capital's children were unfairly killed by the district's savages during the infamous Capital Games of 78, the districts continued ruling over the capital in a way that they deemed to be democratic, which did in fact lead to lower productivity throughout Panem and overall happiness amongst capital citizens. Yet in the later months of 87 and early months of 88, a period of our history that is now fondly known as the Reclamation occurred. A brave group of men and women from the capital decided to create a network named the Reclaimers, whose sole aim was to overthrow the district rule and re-establish the traditional way of life, which would see the capital rightly back in control of Panem, whilst punishing the districts not only for the first rebellion before the Hunger Games began, but also for being responsible for the deaths of countless capital citizens and destroying parts of their city during the Second Rebellion. During the early months of 88, the Reclaimers successfully managed to sabotage the transport links between a number of districts, which made it more difficult for them to transport their produce to each other. They were also successful in triggering an influenza outbreak into District 6, which made it difficult for the workers of this district to repair these broken transport links. Following this, groups of Reclaimers moved to various districts, with forged identity documents that claimed they hailed from other districts, which afforded them better access to the main facilities of the districts. After familiarizing themselves with the main sources of production and routines of each district's citizens, the groups of Reclaimers wisely hatched plans to destroy the district's sources of production, and hence income, which they correctly assumed would unbalance the district's economies and lead to temporary poverty for its citizens. Over the next year, the Reclaimers needed to cause a range of factory explosions, power outages, crop failures, floral diseases, and epidemics throughout the districts, in order to take back control. However, they did not cause any of these disasters in District 13. The Reclaimers even convinced the directors of the capital's main power plant to trigger week-long power outages, in order to make it seem like the capital was also experiencing problems alongside the districts, all at the hands of District 13. Although the representatives of District 13 insisted on multiple occasions that they had not caused any of these recent disasters in the capital or the other districts, they were generally not believed by other districts, especially seeing as the people of District 13 had not made any effort to help those of their fellow districts before the Second Rebellion, despite possessing a large arsenal of nuclear weapons. By April of 88, many districts were suffering from economic, sanitary, and political turmoil, which left them desperate for any solution to their problems, whilst many of the district citizens continued to protest against the actions that they still foolishly believed were being committed by District 13. It was even theorized by some that this was the aforementioned district's way of exacting revenge for the assassination of their representative, Al McCoyne, back in 76. During the height of the protests, the Reclaimers wisely instructed the directors of the capital's power plant to cease the power outages, whilst other capital factories began to produce the food, water, medicine, and other resources that the districts were most in need of. The districts were then allowed to apply for support and aid from the capital, as long as they agreed to offer up one boy and one girl from their population each year, in order to compete in a fight to the death that would once again be known as the Hunger Games. Many district representatives were somewhat skeptical about this agreement, but as more and more citizens continued to die from disease, famine, violence, or a mixture of these problems, the citizens started to bow under pressure and agreed to re-accept the rule of the capital, with District 12 being the first to apply for the capital's support on the 1st of May in 88. When the quality of life in District 12 quickly improved, the other districts wisely realised that they once again needed to accept the rule of the capital, and on the 4th of June, District 8 became the last to accept the capital's governance. As a way of rewarding the districts for their wise choice to re-accept the capital's rule, District 13 was shown to be destroyed on live television by a barrage of missiles sent by the capital. Yet even to this day, many capital scholars debate about how long it was after the Reclamation that the districts realised that they had been so easily manipulated by the superior intelligence of the capital. One of the most charismatic and senior members of the Reclaimers was Salazar Ghoul, a 32-year-old veterinary psychologist with a love for zoological experimentation. Despite being responsible for triggering a ciguatera outbreak in District 4 in order to help the Reclaimers' cause, Ghoul obviously still cared for the citizens of all districts. He was therefore one of several capital citizens who took part in the Saviour Tour of 88, in which various members of the capital, many of which were formerly Reclaimers, toured the districts throughout June and spoke at ceremonies that were mandatory for all citizens, so that they would all hear the new message of Panem and learn of their new roles in leading our great nation forward. Salazar Ghoul immediately made a strong impression with many citizens and was admired for his strong and stable leadership and uplifting words. His authority was also aided by his good looks and sharp wit. The week after the Saviour Tour had ended, elections were held, which were kindly opened to the citizens of the districts as well. In His Excellency, Ghoul was voted to be the new president of Panem with 96% of the votes. The next week, President Ghoul was sworn into his new role, and politically minded citizens of the capital were assigned as representatives to the 12 districts. During his inaugural speech, Ghoul reminded the district citizens of the importance of the games and the need for cohesion between the capital and the districts, especially at this trying time. He therefore announced that the reaping for the 76th Games would occur as had always been tradition on the 4th of July, and that starting with the 80th Games, there would be a special quinquennial quell every 5 years, in order to send an important message on a more regular basis. The evening after these election results, the executions of several radicals were aired live on Capital TV. Amongst those who were terminated were Leith Paler, the disgraced former president, and Ludo Ring, who had been responsible for causing the deaths of 23 capital children during the capital games of 78. Shortly after these savages were executed, it was announced that Viewing Square would be renamed Snow Square, after the former president who had been mercilessly killed by rebels. The proceedings for the 76th Hunger Games were quickly put into place, and President Ghoul ordered for a large increase of funding to the Ghoul Institute. This zoological research facility had been set up by the sister of President Ghoul's great-grandfather, Volumnia Ghoul. It had also been responsible for producing some of the most memorable mutts throughout the Hunger Games, and this therefore left the capital citizens in anticipation to see these upcoming games. Prior to the Reclamation's completion, there were still 9 former victors remaining, and in order to punish them for voting in favour of the capital games, President Ghoul was keen to place most of them into the 76th Hunger Games in order to send a clear message to the districts that rebellion would not be tolerated in any form. Due to her advanced age and years of service to the capital's entertainment industry, Bluebell Jansen was understandably excused from having to compete in these games. Meanwhile, Hamish Abernathy was killed in May when he had tried to escape from District 12 and attacked a capital guard in the process, who was naturally forced to kill Hamish in self-defense. As for the remaining victors, they were captured during the Reclamation and taken to the capital. They were each taken to individual holding cells and subsequently given a choice that was known as the Victor's Choice. For this decision, they were informed that they could either compete in the 76th Hunger Games as the tribute for their district's gender and then live freely if they won, or they could not compete and move to the capital. They each had a minute to make their decision and were not allowed to ask any questions during this time. If they chose to live in the capital, they would need to sign a decree that was placed in the cells with them before the minute had ended. However, little did these victors know that in his wisdom, President Ghoul had decided to write a certain part of the decree with a type of ink that was invisible to the naked eye, until it was later exposed to sunlight. This part of the decree stated that if a tribute chose to live in the capital, then 3 tributes of their gender would be reaped from their district and forced to fight in their place. Some ministers allegedly thought that it was slightly harsh to not give these victors the full details of what they were signing, but President Gore correctly responded that these victors had previously tricked the Capitol during the 75th Hunger Games, and this was therefore a very fitting punishment for them. B.T. Latier from 3, Annie Crester from 4, and Michelle Onassis from 10 each signed the decree to live in the Capitol. This therefore meant that 3 male tributes from District 3, 3 female tributes from District 4, and 3 female tributes from District 10 would be taking part in these games, which brought the total number of tributes this year to 30. It is alleged that Annie became hysterical when it was later revealed to her what she had signed. On the other hand, Ina Baria Golding from 2, Joanna Mason from 7, and Peter and Katniss Malak, both from 12, each chose to compete in the games instead of letting someone compete in their place. Joanna apparently only took a few seconds to make her decision by stating that she would rather die than live in the Capitol. The Reapings therefore went ahead on the 4th of July. Many Capital and District citizens alike stated that they felt a sense of nostalgia during the Reapings, whilst many children who were experiencing the ceremony for the first time needed to be reminded by Capitol guards to behave properly. This even led to several rowdy young people from various districts needing to be physically beaten by the guards in order to allow Reapings to continue smoothly. District 12's Reaping would have taken place first, but seeing as their tributes were pre-selected as Peter and Katniss Malak, this Reaping was not necessary. At District 7's Reaping, Joanna was placed under guard and forced to stand on the platform with the escort. She was then given the task of picking the name of the male tribute for her district, which many Capital citizens pointed out was a form of poetic justice, after she had revelled in choosing the names of the tributes for the Capital Games 10 years earlier. After a guard practically forced Joanna's hand into the reaping bowl to pick out a name, it was revealed that she had chosen Maple Best, a gentle-looking 16-year-old with an absent expression and scruffy red hair. When his name was announced, his mother screamed out from the crowd, and she had to be slapped by a guard so that the reaping could proceed. Maple quietly sang to himself as he walked towards the platform in an apparent state of shock, and it was noticed that Joanna rolled her eyes when he was close enough for her to hear his singing. Meanwhile in District 2, Inabaria was given the same task, and she initially chose a young lad named Ferrus. However, as he was about to make his way to the platform, an 18-year-old named Ennius Dalton immediately volunteered himself from the back of the reaping enclosure. Although Ennius had a reasonably sized afro, it was dwarfed by his extremely muscular frame, with his shirt almost breaking at the seams. Even Inabaria appeared amazed by the sheer size of Ennius as he strutted to the platform. Most of the other reapings occurred as planned, although there was some outrage in Districts 3, 4 and 10, when 2 more tributes than normal were chosen, although luckily for all, the guards acted quickly and made sure that the proceedings continued as normal. As is tradition, tributes were given a short farewell period with their friends and families before being taken by train to the capital. This year, President Gall did not wish to take any chances and ordered armed guards to be placed throughout the trains and even in the tributes' carriages as they slept. Meanwhile, Peter and Katniss were already being held in the capital, and therefore did not need to be transported. Shortly after setting off from District 7, Joanna was informed by the escort that she would be Maple's mentor. She allegedly became very angry at learning this, but tried asking Maple some questions about his skills. When he told Joanna that he had never touched an axe, but that he liked to sing to the birds in the forest and draw pictures of them, Joanna spat out the whiskey that she had just swallowed before storming out of the train carriage and punching the wall in anger. Meanwhile, Inabaria tried to engage with Ennius in her role as mentor, but according to the guards, Ennius quickly told her that he had already practiced fighting throughout his life with his older sisters, several of whom had fought in the volunteer games for District 2. He therefore told Inabaria that he did not need her help, and spent most of the journey lifting weights in his carriage. After arriving in the capital, Inabaria and Joanna went to meet Peter and Katniss in the apartment for District 12. Although the tributes were at first told that they could not meet their counterparts of other districts, President Gall cleverly decided that this could make the events before the games, along with the games themselves, more interesting. He therefore requested more guards to be brought into the accommodation building, and ordered them to be placed in each room and at each entrance and exit of all the apartments, in order to allow tributes to meet each other, while suppressing any rebellious behaviour between them. When the 4 victors met, they allegedly discussed the behaviour of Ennius and Maple, and agreed to form an alliance without these 2 tributes, in the hopes that one of the 4 of them would survive, which they foolishly believed would be enough to stop the games continuing into the future. Joanna was allegedly removed from this apartment after drinking too much whiskey and continually insulting one of the guards before making threats against his mother. The parade subsequently took place in the Avenue of the Tributes, just like it had prior to the Second Rebellion, and the stylists gifted their tributes with fabulous designs for them to wear. It was noted that the price of entry was much higher than in previous years, presumably due to the many capital citizens who had been deprived of this fine spectacle for the last 12 years, and understandably wanted to witness the parade once more. For the first time ever, District 12's design was based on the medical expertise of this district, and Peter and Katniss were dressed in sparkling versions of the traditional teal cloaks that were worn by the chief healers of District 12. They were also adorned with dazzling white masks over their mouths, and it is rumoured that President Gall did not want either of them to be able to shout any obscenities to the capital citizens in the crowd, and this is why he asked their stylists, Jurgen Cardew and Felicia Breen, to cover their mouths. Joanna and Maple were dressed as glamorous oak trees. Maple appeared nervous, but he still smiled and waved at the crowd, whilst Joanna was jeered when she ripped bits of bark away from over her face and threw them into the audience. Enobaria and Ennius were dressed as classical Roman soldiers. Although Enobaria tried to raise Ennius's hand into the air with her own, he rejected her hand and turned away before continuing to wave towards the crowd. Some capital viewers were initially confused to see 4 tributes each from Districts 3, 4 and 10 on larger carriages, but it was quickly explained by this year's commentator Eugenia Ravenstill why there were more tributes from these districts. Donald Crane, a former leading peacekeeper, was placed in the position of Master of Training, and despite his advancing age, Crane immediately made a strong impression on both tributes and the assessors, by enforcing very strict rules, and allegedly scaring some of the tributes with his imposing stature and ever-present authority. During training, Enobaria, Joanna, Peter and Katniss appeared to hold occasional meetings, presumably regarding the other tributes. It was noted by some assessors that this group's actions and collective behaviour resembled those of traditional career packs from before the Second Rebellion. Although Joanna was supposed to be Maple's mentor, she selfishly ignored him and fended for herself by spending the days practicing her axing skills on her own. In the first afternoon, she threw an axe very close to the head of Wyra from 3, which made Wyra scream out in fear, and Joanna made no effort to hide her laughter when she was reprimanded for this by training staff. Peter worked with Maple and showed him the basics of using a sword, but it soon became obvious that Maple would never learn how to use one in time. However, when Peter showed him how he could camouflage himself against various surfaces and patterns around the training room, Maple was much more interested, and Peter appeared genuinely impressed with how quickly Maple managed to learn these skills. This later led to Joanna arguing with Peter and asking him not to help Maple. Katniss spent most of her time on her own, and fired arrow after arrow at targets on the shooting range. When Grayling from 4 approached her and for some reason told her how much he admired her, Katniss ignored Grayling and continued to fire arrows with a dazed expression on her face. Meanwhile, Enobaria practiced fighting with training staff, and it was noted that she occasionally snarled and bared her teeth at other tributes, which did indeed scare some of them. Other training staff remarked that another large group appeared to be forming between the tributes of Districts 3, 4 and 10, which totalled almost 10 tributes by the end of training, and they seemed to be watching the Victor Pack very carefully. However, they did not appear to trust or hence accept Ennius or Maple, possibly due to them being from the same districts as these victors. During the pre-games commentary, Eugenia Ravenstill commented that this group would be the most likely to be able to defeat the Victor Pack. For the assessment of the training scores, the demonstrated skills of all tributes were kept secret, as was the custom before the Second Rebellion. However, Peter, Katniss, Enobaria and Joanna each scored a 12, which was understandable, seeing as they had already survived 2 different games. This instantly made them strong contenders in the eyes of their fellow tributes. Ennius and Maple also managed to score well, and were the next highest scorers, both walking out with a 10. Other high scorers included Joe from 3, Grayling from 4, Connor from 8, and Angus from 10, who each scored either 8 or 9. The remaining scores ranged all the way from 7 down to 2, with the slowest score being shared by Volta from 5, Hazel from 9, and Matilda from 10. The next day the interviews took place, with Eugenia Ravenstill conducting a triumphant first set of interviews. At the time, she was only 29 years old, but had already developed an inquisitive, yet entertaining manner with the tributes, and was always known to be able to ask the most personal and risque questions without being affected by the ensuing reactions. Furthermore, her figure-hugging gown of black and white diamonds, along with her matching hairstyle, made her an instant icon in the eyes of Capitol viewers. President Gall once again insisted that guards stood between Eugenia and the tribute that she was interviewing, along with the other guards closely watching the queue of tributes who were about to be interviewed. It was wise that President Gall insisted upon this, as during Ina Barria's interview, she looked like she was about to bite Eugenia's neck, especially when Eugenia asked her if her teeth made it difficult to hold down a relationship, much to the amusement of the audience. Ennius was after Ina Barria, and instantly made himself a firm favourite with the audience, when he told Eugenia that he had wanted to compete in the Hunger Games, and had practised all of his life to compete, even before the age of 6, but he had never had the chance until now. When it was time for Joanna's interview, she refused to walk out and shoved her middle finger out from behind the curtain at the side of the stage, to gasps and jeers from the audience. Seeing as she had been extremely rude during an earlier interview, the guards were not ordered to force her onto the stage, but simply let her leave this impression of herself before the games began. Maple's interview was not much of an improvement, and Eugenia had to tell him to raise his voice on several occasions, which was met with laughter from the audience. Katniss hardly said a word during her interview, except for mentioning that she was waiting to wake up from this nightmare, despite the fact that she had chosen to fight in these games. Eugenia hardly received any answers to her questions, and was allegedly ordered through her earpiece to finish this final interview early, as it appeared that Katniss was about to pounce upon Eugenia when she spoke about Peter. When it was Peter's turn, he spoke calmly to Eugenia, and stated that he and the other victors thought they should not have to fight in these games, to which Eugenia correctly replied that they had all been given a choice and he had chosen to come here, which was applauded by the audience, and his interview was terminated shortly afterwards. The final person to be interviewed was the new game maker, Penelope Paddock, a middle-aged woman who had helped to design the Capitol's defense system during the rebel invasion of the Capitol in 76. Game maker Paddock mentioned to Eugenia that this year's games would take place in a rather familiar setting that was also appropriate for this new beginning, which garnered a curious and excited gasp from the audience. She also went on to mention that there would be a special surprise for Capitol citizens within this arena, and that tributes would even be given a choice of what they wore for the games. And so, when tributes were taken to their holding rooms the next day, they were given the choice of what to wear, and all 4 of the victor pack decided to wear a shirt, trousers and jacket that would be relatively appropriate for any kind of arena. They then got into their tubes and readied themselves for the games. This year's games took place in an arena known as the Amphitheater Quarter. During the Second Rebellion of 76, the Capitol Amphitheater and its surrounding streets were heavily bombed by the rebel savages, who clearly had no respect for the history that this majestic building contained. Prior to these games in 88, this quarter of the Capitol had never been fully rebuilt to the same standards as the rest of the city, and therefore the houses in these streets were relatively small for Capitol standards. The amphitheater, which hosted the first 10 games, had been badly damaged on one side, but its structure was still sound and was therefore selected for these games, due to its significance within these new beginnings for Panem. As tributes were waiting in their holding rooms, the live feed began on Capitol TV, and when citizens saw that the amphitheater was about to be used as the arena, triumphant cheers were heard all over Snow Square, when they realized that they were about to see this iconic location in action once again. Eugenia Ravenstill, who was commentating this year's games along with the Master of Training, Donald Crane, mentioned that the limits of the arena did not only reach the edge of the amphitheater, but also reached several hundred meters beyond, into the surrounding streets. Therefore, this year's arena was henceforth known as the Amphitheater Quarter. Furthermore, for the first time in the history of the Hunger Games, several lucky Capitol families had each been allowed to stay in a 2-story villa within the arena, which were evenly scattered around the surrounding streets of the amphitheater. None of these villas had stairs, and therefore the families could only walk around the top floor and balconies, whilst the tributes were only able to access the bottom floor if the inhabiting family pressed a switch that would open the front door and give them access. To make this opportunity even more special, the families would not only be given an outstanding view of the action within the arena, but they would also be given a range of supplies that they could give to tributes if they came near enough to the villa. On the other hand, each family was also given explosive grenades and large stones that the parents could throw at tributes if they so wished, along with firecrackers for their children to use. It was also stated that if a tribute even harmed another tribute whilst in the villa, or remained there after dusk, their tracker would be detonated. When these rules were announced by Eugenia, there were murmurs of excitement from the crowd in Snow Square, and the tributes entered the arena shortly afterwards. Tributes rose into the arena on podiums around the edge of the theatre's floor. They wore an array of colours, materials and styles, with Eugenia spending this opening time talking about how she disliked the denim outfit worn by Crochette from 8, but that she much preferred the orange tulle dress worn by Hazel from 9, on the adjacent podium, until Donald brought her attention back to the events at hand. Most of the tributes seemed confused about their surroundings, and looked around the arena and at each other, presumably for answers. Yet most of them started to realise that there were tunnels behind and around them that they could escape through, as well as higher levels of the theatre's infrastructure if they chose to stay there. In the centre of the amphitheatre's floor lay a rectangular hole, which was dubbed by Donald as the Death Drop. Surrounding the Death Drop was a slightly lower than average quantity of bread and water bottles, along with an array of weapons that were so close to the hole that they practically dangled over the edge. As the countdown from 20 seconds began, Peter from 12, who was in between Flint from 1 and Brent from 5, looked at Katniss from 12 and shook his head. Katniss, who was on the other side of the arena between Buttercup from 11 and Algon from 4, looked back at Peter and seemed confused about where they could run, but she appeared to have her eye on the bow and arrows in front of her. Joanna from 7 and Inabaria from 2 were in equidistant positions between Katniss and Peter, and they were clearly aiming for the weapons in front of them as well. The gong sounded, and about 10 of the tributes, including Maple from 7, Crochette from 8, and Matilda from 10, immediately fled from the action, with some of these escaping tributes almost tripping as they scurried into the narrow tunnels away from the theatre's floor to relative safety. However, the majority of tributes ran to the centre, past the supplies and straight to the weapons. This immediately resulted in some very quick deaths, when certain tributes tried to grab weapons, but were pushed into the Death Drop, in which it was later revealed that Game Maker Paddock had decided to have large spikes installed, which could easily slice through human flesh. Peter was the first from the Victor Pack to land in trouble when Flint and Velvon, both from 1, tackled him just seconds after the gong sounded. Flint then knocked off Peter's prosthetic leg and ran to grab a weapon whilst Velvon held Peter down. However, Joanna, who had already grabbed an axe, spotted what was about to happen, and just as Flint grabbed a sword, Joanna chopped off her hand with the axe, and Flint fell screaming into the Death Drop. Meanwhile, Katniss, who had managed to seize a bow and arrow from an escaping Greyling from 4, quickly shot Velvon in the head, before shooting at various other competitors, and this gave Peter time to reattach his leg and get back up. On the other side of the theatre, Inabaria had been pinned to the ground by Balon from 9, right next to the Death Drop. Being rather muscular, Balon had almost managed to force a knife down through Inabaria's head, but just behind Balon's back, Ennius slashed Hazel from 9 with a sword, and she fell backwards into Balon with such force that they were both knocked into the Death Drop. Ennius immediately lunged at Inabaria with his sword, but she threw herself backwards and away from the Death Drop. Ennius then became distracted by Buttercup from 11, who had just snuck a knife in front of where he was standing, and as he chased her into a nearby tunnel, Inabaria grabbed a scythe and scarpered away. Once she was able to look around the carnage of the theatre floor, she appeared to realise that most surviving tributes had either fled or were in the process of doing so. The Victor Pack then gathered their remaining supplies and made sure that they each had a weapon. Joanna suggested pushing the remaining weapons into the Death Drop, so that other tributes would not be able to access them, and the group proceeded to push them into the hole, which silenced the painful groans of Flint and Balon, who were somehow still alive until that point. As the group heard screams echo through the tunnels, they looked around the theatre, and Peter suggested that they climb up to the large, thick wall around the lower and more eroded side of the theatre, in order to have a better view of the upper levels, and also be able to see the area surrounding the theatre, which they proceeded to do. A hovercraft arrived and collected the bodies from the Death Drop, which took a grimly long time to do. the Victor Pack looked out beyond the theatre and were surprised to see the buildings of the capital surrounding them, which prompted Inabaria to tell the rest of the group that they were in the amphitheatre that was used in the earliest games. Joanna in particular was rather sceptical about this theory, but Inabaria said that she had seen this arena many times when she had to watch past games in the training academy, and that she could not easily forget what this arena looked like. After seeing people waving from Capitol buildings in the distance, the group realised that this was not a hologram of any sorts, and that Inabaria was indeed correct. Katniss and Joanna then proceeded to grab any remaining food and drink supplies and put them in a pile by their new base on the wall, whilst Peter asked Inabaria some more questions about the layout of the amphitheatre. But just as Katniss was bringing over the last of the water bottles, a bright neon snake suddenly slithered out of one of the tunnels and straight towards her. Peter shouted a warning at Katniss, and as she ran, she dropped the remaining water bottles that she was carrying, and more of these snakes quickly appeared. The snakes very nearly managed to bite Katniss's leg, and they even managed to nip at her boots, but with the help of Peter and Inabaria, she was able to get back onto the wall and to relative safety. More and more snakes entered through the tunnels and onto the floor of the theatre, which worried the victors slightly, as the snakes sometimes slithered up the wall towards them. But Joanna used her axe to slice off the heads of the snakes and deter the rest of their number, which eventually sent the majority back through the tunnels, and viewers saw them proceed to slither into the streets. The pack then discussed their strategy for the rest of the day. Although Inabaria and Joanna were keen to enter the streets and hunt down other tributes, Peter reminded them that the snakes would be there, and that it could be easier to eliminate other tributes once the snakes had died out to some degree. Katniss agreed with Peter, and the group eventually decided to wait until night time at least. When they reached this consensus, 9 cannons sounded out, which left 21 tributes remaining. Over the next hour, Joanna kept watch for the snakes, whilst Katniss slept and Peter and Inabaria looked at the buildings in the outer streets. They were surprised to see other tributes outside the amphitheatre trying to enter these buildings, but they were even more surprised to see Capitol citizens upon the balconies of these buildings. Yet as the afternoon went by, Joanna pointed out another group of tributes that had just appeared in the upper stands at the opposite side of the arena. Although they had trouble distinguishing who was in this other group, Eugenia mentioned to viewers that these tributes were Jo and Wyra, both from 3, Algon and Grayling, both from 4, and Angus and Beth, both from 10, before talking about how she was glad that Algon was already 18 years old, and that he could come to her house if she won. But when she went into further detail about what they could do in her house, she was quickly averted back to the game's events by Donald. Each group discussed what they could ascertain about the other, and the victors correctly identified that the others had also managed to acquire supplies and weapons from the bloodbath. This led to what is known as a stalemate, with both groups reaching the conclusion that it was not wise to attack the other, especially before sunset. The Victor Pack therefore spent the rest of the afternoon and early evening keeping watch and resting on the wall. Joanna rested, whilst Peter examined the surrounding streets and watched as other tributes would occasionally run in and out of vision. However, he became rather confused when he saw 2 tributes appearing to try and talk to a Capitol woman who was stood on one of the balconies of a villa. Peter could not see that these were 2 of the youngest tributes, Liberty and Megan, both from 6, and the woman on the balcony was Agnes Cardew, the chief director of Cardew Banking. The cameras could not pick up what was being said, but it is thought that the pair asked Director Cardew for food. This greatly angered her, and she quickly threw a grenade down onto these tributes below, which caused a loud explosion and small fire. This commotion woke up Joanna and made all 4 of the victors look over in shock. Director Cardew stormed back off the balcony and into the villa whilst a cannon sounded. The male tribute, Liberty, despite now bleeding profusely from his charred body, was just about able to crawl away, but Connor from 8, who was nearby and had heard this commotion, quickly appeared across the street and stabbed Liberty in the head, which produced another cannon, and the bodies of the pair were subsequently collected by a hovercraft. The Victor Pack then had a discussion and agreed that some of them would leave the amphitheatre the next day in order to investigate and see if there was anything useful within the surrounding streets, but they also agreed that they would not leave for very long, due to the apparently dangerous hazards that lay outside the amphitheatre. Towards the end of this discussion, Joanna let out a laugh, and when Katniss asked what was so funny, Joanna said that nobody would ever think that the theatre would have become a kind of safe haven for them. She proceeded to find this so apparently funny that she started to cry with laughter. The sun proceeded to set, and the group took turns to keep watch and sleep. From the other side of the theatre, they could still hear the whispers of the other pack, along with occasional hissing from snakes within the theatre. The fallen were shown in the sky, and portraits of Velvin and Flint, both from 1, a boy from 3, 2 of the girls from 4, Liberty and Megan, both from 6, Barlon and Hazel, both from 9, a girl from 10, and Buttercup from 11 were now deceased, which left 19 tributes remaining. Peter held Katniss as she cried at the sight of the fallen, whilst Enabaria slept, and Joanna continued to keep watch over the theatre. Katniss was then about to grab some water from the pile of supplies when she jumped at the sound of a scream from the other side of the arena. Viewers had seen that Brent and Volta, both from 5, had managed to trap and capture one of the snakes in a water bottle earlier in the day. In the minutes before this scream, they had carefully walked through the tunnels until they found the other pack of tributes on the opposing side of the arena to the victor pack. It was then that Volta released this snake into the tunnel that led to the other pack. This resulted in the snake inconspicuously slithering through the darkness towards the group, and it bit Algon on the neck, which awoke him immediately and made him scream out in pain and frustration. As the others in his group quickly woke up, Wyra from 3 saw the snake slithering straight towards her, and this made her scurry back, but due to the darkness and her apparent disorientation, she misjudged her position and tripped back off the wall before tumbling down the stands and cracking her head on the floor of the theatre. As Wyra's cannon boomed out, the snake slithered away and the others saw Algon nursing his wound from the snake's bite, which was rapidly turning an array of bright neon colours in the light of the moon. He immediately pleaded with his allies to help him, but Angus, who was stood behind Algon, stabbed him through the back of the neck without a second thought, and Algon collapsed to the ground, with his cannon ringing out just a few seconds later. The hovercraft came to retrieve the bodies of Wyra and Algon, and both packs checked that there were no more snakes in their respective vicinities. Once they had all checked that they were safe, most tributes in the theatre went back to sleep, with Enabaria and Grayling keeping watch over their groups. The sun rose a few hours later, and both groups could see that their opponents were still in the same position. As the victors had discussed the day before, some of them would venture out into the streets, which after some discussion, Peter and Enabaria agreed to do. Katniss and Joanna very carefully kept an eye on the opposing group, as Peter and Enabaria considered what was the best way to leave the theatre, but realizing that there could be other tributes waiting in the surrounding tunnels, they agreed to sprint across the exposed area of sandy ground in front of them, and run straight forward into one of the nearby streets. Peter and Enabaria quickly jumped off the wall and ran forwards, just as they reached a grassy area in front of them. An arrow was shot in their direction, which very nearly hit Peter in the arm, but he jumped out of the way, and the pair carried on running forwards, just as another arrow glided past them. They eventually reached a small side alley, which they practically dived into. It was revealed to viewers that Matilda had shot these arrows at them, but having only just started to train with a bow and arrow during training, her aim was somewhat inaccurate. Enabaria checked that Peter was still well enough to continue onwards, and after a brief rest, they sprinted out of the alley and into a larger adjacent street. They walked through slowly, with their swords at the ready, but although they appeared to hear cheers and jeers from capital villas in the distance, the surrounding area was eerily quiet. They walked onwards for a few more minutes, and noticed an abandoned bakery, which Peter insisted that they enter. But unfortunately for them, they found no useful resources or edible bread, and so they continued. Yet just a minute later, Peter quickly tackled Enabaria to the ground, when an explosion occurred just in front of them. The duo had unknowingly walked past a capital villa that housed a rather fervent branch of the Snow family, one of whom had aimed a grenade straight at them. Enabaria appeared to be in shock, but Peter grabbed her and hoisted her up, just as a shower of stones and firecrackers was thrown in their direction. They sprinted onwards together, but just as they turned the next corner, Enabaria was punched to the floor. Peter fell with Enabaria, and quickly glanced upwards to see Rockcrest from 11, towering over the pair. Rockcrest brought down another fist against Peter, which knocked the sword from Peter's hand. Rockcrest then went to grab the sword from the ground, but Enabaria jumped upwards towards him, and she bit into his hand. Rockcrest immediately yelled out in anguish, and once Enabaria let go, he was mortified to see that 3 of his fingers had been bitten off, which Enabaria proceeded to spit out. Peter then grabbed the sword and quickly stood back up. Despite the intense pain that he was clearly experiencing, Rockcrest put out his heavily injured hand and pleaded with Peter not to hurt him. But Peter gave him a melancholic look before slicing his neck with the sword. Rockcrest fell to the ground with a splatter of blood, and his cannon sounded. But just as Enabaria was getting her breath back, a spear was thrust straight into her back. Inabaria yelped out and fell over, whilst Peter span around to see Crochet from 8, getting ready to poke him with his spear as well. Peter waved his sword at Crochet, but she was stood far enough from the range of Peter's sword due to the length of the spear that she was holding. Whilst Inabaria tried and failed to get up, Crochet proceeded to jab at Peter's feet, which made his prosthetic leg fall off, and he collapsed to the ground. Eugenia Ravenstill gushed with excitement as cheers from Snow Square raged on through this fight. But just when it appeared that Crochet might actually be about to kill these two strong competitors, Inabaria threw Peter's sword towards Crochet, and it forced its way straight through her shoulder. Crochet dropped the spear and tried to hold her wound as Inabaria managed to get back up. She tackled Crochet, who screamed out for mercy, but Inabaria bared her teeth at Crochet, who was now screaming, before biting into her throat and spitting out flesh. Inabaria appeared to be going for a second bite of Crochet's limp body, but Peter, who had now just about managed to put his leg back on, tugged on her shoulder and shouted that they needed to go. As the pair hobbled away, a cannon sounded, and a hovercraft came in to collect the bodies of Rockress and Crochet. Inabaria was able to run slightly quicker than Peter, but he pointed out that there could easily be more tributes around this area, or even following them, so they should travel slowly yet carefully, which Inabaria appeared to agree to. A cannon sounded as they made their way through the street, and viewers saw that this cannon belonged to one of the boys from District 3, who had previously been bitten by one of the snakes, before being hunted down by Ennius and beheaded. As his body was lifted by the hovercraft from an alley near the amphitheater, many capital citizens marvelled at the bright colours of his body, and Eugenia Ravenstill correctly predicted that the colour tones could soon start a new fashion trend within the capital. However, when Peter and Inabaria heard this cannon, they turned round and almost simultaneously gasped in horror. Peter had to quickly grab onto Inabaria's hand in order to run away from an oozing human-height wave of thick black tar that was quietly moving at a steady speed down the street towards them. It was explained to viewers by Eugenia that this tar was coming in from all directions of the perimeter, in order to bring out some of the tributes who were hiding and not putting on the show that the capital deserved. Just as Inabaria started running, Peter looked back and saw Volta and Brent turning a corner onto the street about several hundred meters behind them. Peter and Inabaria continued to run to the amphitheater as Volta tripped and was engulfed by the wave of tar, which sounded her cannon shortly afterwards. Brent, on the other hand, ignored Volta's demise and sprinted frantically from the wave of tar, but as it neared him and he ran past the villa of Tiberia Vickers, one of her children threw a firecracker from their balcony, and it landed just behind where Brent was running. When the wave reached the firecracker, a combustion of fire flowed through the wave as it raced towards Brent. He was distracted by the explosion and turned round before screaming at the wave of fire that was approaching, which made him transfixed to the spot. The wave subsequently engulfed his body, and his cannons sounded almost immediately. Meanwhile, Peter and Inabaria continued running away from the wave, that was becoming less flammable and returning to tar. They passed an array of side streets and neared a villa that was occupied by General Euclid Demigloss and his family. The wave continued towards Peter and Inabaria, and just as they seemed to be considering avoiding the Demigloss villa, Grayling ran past another building and collided with Peter, which made them both fall over. The teenage sons of the Demigloss family rushed over to their balcony and shouted at Grayling to enter their villa, with their father later revealing that he had betted good money on a tribute from District 4 to win. Despite holding a sharp knife, Grayling did not even attempt to stab Peter or Inabaria, and she ran towards the villa instead, whilst the wave was now within about 20 seconds of their location. However, Inabaria quickly tackled Grayling and held a knife to her throat. She then shouted that she and Peter needed to enter the villa as well. At first, the sons of the family protested, but as the wave neared them, and Inabaria literally stood her ground with Grayling pinned against her chest, General Demigloss ran to the balcony and shouted at them all to come in, which they proceeded to do, with Peter slamming the front door behind them just as the wave collided with the bottom of the villa. It is unknown exactly what happened over the next hour whilst the three tributes were in the safety of the villa, especially as the tributes and the Demigloss family could not enter the same floor of the building. But General Demigloss later stated in an interview with Eugenia Ravenstill that he had heard Grayling ask Peter and Inabaria about what it was like to be a victor, and Peter simply replied to her that if she won, she should try to make the most of her life. Once the tar had flowed away into a large system of drains around the arena, Grayling was ordered to leave first, before Peter and Inabaria were allowed to leave, which gave Grayling a head start from them. Peter allegedly said that he had no interest in killing Grayling, which made the Demigloss family laugh at this blatant lie. When Peter and Enobaria were ejected, they rushed back through the streets, where they noticed an old water well near to where they had come from in the amphitheater. Peter wanted to inspect the well, but Enobaria made him hurry onwards. When they finally made it back, they alerted Joanna and Katniss to help them back up onto the wall, and Katniss broke down in tears with relief at seeing Peter again. Joanna and Katniss had mainly been relaxing for most of the day, and they helped Peter and Enobaria back up onto the wall. They then had something to eat and drink, whilst the other pack on the opposite side of the theatre continued to watch them. As they ate, they heard another cannon, which viewers saw was belonging to Matilda, when she had tried to climb up on the roof of the villa belonging to Commander Anastasia Bell and her family. Although she had managed to climb up using the bricks and windows without the Bell family noticing, the second her hand touched the roof, her tracker exploded, which caused her arm to explode off her body, and she fell backwards onto the street below, before dying of blood loss shortly afterwards. As the Victor Pack made arrangements for the night watch, the portraits of Wyra and one of the other boys from 3, Algon from 4, Brent and Volta, both from 5, Crochette from 8, Matilda from 10, and Rockcrest from 11 were all shown in the sky, which left just 11 tributes now remaining, of which only Ennius, Maple, and Connor were now outside of the amphitheatre. Viewers had seen that so far Ennius and Connor had spent most of their time roaming around the arena and killing anyone they could find, and despite having a few near misses, they had not yet run into each other. Maple, on the other hand, had been offered refuge by the Bell family on the first day, and had found an abandoned art store, which gave him access to paints that he used to camouflage himself into the street. There were several occasions when other tributes had almost walked into Maple when they had explored these streets, but he had so far gone undetected. As the next morning went by, the stalemate continued between the two rival packs, with each of them having one of their members look out from the theatre for the snakes and any passing threats, whilst another member held a weapon ready and faced the other pack. Eugenia Ravenstill captured the thoughts of Panem when she stated that this was probably one of the most surreal standoffs that she had ever witnessed in the history of the Hunger Games. Around noon, the Victor Pack realised that they had almost run out of water. They considered how long they could last without any water, until Peter suggested that one of the capital families in the surrounding villas might gift them with some water. However, Joanna correctly responded that this would be extremely unlikely, seeing as most of these families hated them. Peter then mentioned that he could fetch some water from the well. Katniss agreed, but insisted that he should not go alone, and although Joanna offered herself to go with Peter, Katniss begged to go instead. It is heavily debated as to why Katniss was so intent on collecting water with Peter, but most experts believe that she was planning on convincing him to betray their allies. However, whether this was true or not, the group failed to notice that Jo and Beth had carefully travelled through the tunnels and were now crouched by the edge of the wall on which they were sitting. Just as it was agreed that Katniss would go with Peter, Jo suddenly appeared and threw a knife which hit Katniss's leg. Beth shot an arrow at Katniss as well, although it very narrowly missed her temple. Peter quickly climbed over Katniss in an effort to cover her, and Joanna and Enobaria sprang into action. Enobaria chased after Beth, but whilst Jo was getting ready to throw another knife, Joanna launched an axe straight at him, which hit his head and sounded a cannon before his body had even hit the floor. Enobaria chased after Beth around the side of the theatre, but Beth managed to hide in a small alcove of the ruined stones, which allowed her to escape from Enobaria, who eventually gave up on this pursuit, much to her annoyance, before returning to the other victors on the wall. During this altercation, Grayling said to Angus that she would go and help his district partner Beth. Angus agreed, and Grayling took a sword and some water with her, but once she was out of his sight, she immediately ran in the opposite direction and into the tunnels closer to the other side of the theatre. The general consensus amongst Capital viewers is that Grayling worried that these two tributes from District 10 would soon turn on her, and so she wanted to avoid this before it happened. Jo's body was retrieved by the hovercraft, and after the commotion of what had just happened, Peter said that now was the best time for he and Katniss to fetch water from the nearby well that he had seen with Enobaria the day before. Peter and Katniss grabbed some of the empty bottles and carefully got down from the wall with the help of Joanna and Enobaria, before carefully yet quickly heading through the streets, until they eventually reached the small square that contained the well. Once they had the bottles ready, Katniss lowered an attached bucket into the well, and Peter kept watch with his sword. He appeared to be rather tense, which was not helped by the amount of time that Katniss was taking to raise the bucket, which she found to be surprisingly heavy. Realizing that his wife was struggling, Peter eventually put down his sword and walked over to help her. But just as the bucket full of water finally reached the top of the well, Katniss seized up in fear at what she saw behind her husband. Peter noticed Katniss's reaction and looked round to see a monstrously large lion with a bright red mane snarling as it glared at them. Katniss tried to ready her bow and arrow in a way that was as subtle as possible. She whispered that they needed to run in the opposite direction, but at that moment another lion appeared. Peter very quietly whispered to Katniss that if he could not escape, then she should run without him. She looked at him with a worried expression, but he glared at her until she nodded in accordance. Meanwhile, in another street outside the amphitheater, members of the Bell Villa had thrown an undetonated grenade to Maple for him to catch and use later, but when the lion suddenly approached him from behind, he jumped in surprise and tripped, which caused the grenade to detonate and kill him. A cannon sounded, and it took roughly 10 minutes to scrape the remains of his body from the street, which Anastasia Bell's daughter, Karen, allegedly complained had not been cleaned to her satisfaction, meaning that the hovercraft had to return a few minutes later in order to finish this task, which caused great confusion to the tributes who had been watching the hovercraft. Meanwhile, neither Peter nor Katniss seemed to care any more about the water, as they very carefully stepped backwards as the lions quietly growled at them. Yet just as they stepped back, Maple's cannon sounded, and this made the lions roar, and they charged forward. Katniss immediately shot an arrow into the brain of the nearest lion to them, and she and Peter sprinted away. Yet as they ran, Peter tripped and his prosthetic leg snapped off. Katniss screamed at Peter, just as the other lion jumped through the air towards him. Katniss readied her bow and arrow as the lion pounced upon Peter, and he screamed at her to run. As the lion bit into Peter's back, Katniss shot an arrow, which hit it in the back, but did not seem to be noticed by the lion. It bit further into Peter, who continued to scream at Katniss to run. Another lion then turned the corner and charged straight towards Katniss. After letting out a scream of terror, she finally obeyed Peter's orders and ran away from the well. Katniss cried and let out rapid breaths as she ran, then screamed out in tears as Peter's cannon sounded, and she neared the amphitheater, whilst more lions came out from behind other buildings and chased after her. Joanna and Enobaria seemed worried and upset that Peter was not with Katniss, but as the lions continued to chase her, they screamed at her to climb the wall. Although Joanna had to jump down to help Katniss, and she was bitten on the foot by one of these lions, she and Enobaria managed to help Katniss back onto the wall. As dusk set in, Joanna and Enobaria discussed what they should do the next day, but Katniss numbly stared out into the night sky. The Fallen were shown at midnight, and the portraits of Jo from 3, Maple from 7, and Peter from 12 were shown in the sky. Joanna and Enobaria agreed to let Katniss sleep that night, and they took turns between them to keep watch. They both noticed that several lions were still roaming around the surrounding streets, which had in fact forced the 8 surviving tributes back into the amphitheater. When the sun rose the next day, the victors were still on the lower wall of the amphitheater, and they looked over to Angus and Beth, who were on the opposing raised wall. Connor and Grayling had both spent the night hidden in different alcoves of the surrounding tunnels, and their positions were unknown to the other tributes at the time. However, Ennius had spent most of the early morning roaming the upper tunnels, and shortly after sunrise, he reached the entrance to the tunnel next to the wall where Angus was sleeping, and Beth appeared to be daydreaming. Ennius, who was in possession of a sword, a spear, and several knives, looked out onto the wall, and he seemed to realize that now was the time to act. He ran out from the entrance to the tunnel and along the wall. Just as Beth noticed him and she shouted to Angus, Ennius kicked Angus's sword over the side of the wall and rammed his spear straight through Beth's chest as she tried to get up, which caused her to scream and collapse backwards in a pool of blood. Angus suddenly woke up from Beth's scream and panicked at the absence of his weapon. As Beth's cannon sounded, Angus quickly scurried back along the wall from Ennius, who had just turned towards him with his sword at the ready. Angus almost fell off the side of the wall, but he managed to hold on to the side with his hands, and he tried to climb along the wall away from Ennius. However, without anything to put his feet on, this was proving to be difficult. Ennius readied his sword and walked slowly towards Angus, and after a few seconds of consideration, he brought down the sword onto Angus's hand, which cut off his fingers, and hence his grip on the wall. Angus fell several meters, and a loud crack was heard when his skull hit the ground. Although he started to move his hands and even tried to get back up, Connor suddenly emerged from a nearby tunnel, and without any further delay, he plunged his sword through Angus's chest, which sounded his cannon shortly afterwards. Ennius had been looking from the upper wall and appeared tempted to jump down to attack Connor, but he seemed to realise that it would be too much of a risk to jump this distance. After a few minutes of tense inactivity, Katniss, who had been watching this scene along with Joanna and Enabaria, pointed out that no hovercraft had arrived to pick up the body, and Enabaria responded that there were only 6 of them left, and that the game makers must be looking to end the game soon. Just as Katniss came to this stark realization and turned a deadly shade of pale, a platform rose from within the death drop, which appeared to have a small white pill on top of it. Despite having agreed to ally together, in a true district and savage manner, Enabaria punched Joanna and Katniss simultaneously, and with such force that they both fell backwards, before she grabbed her spear, jumped off the wall, and sprinted to the platform. As Joanna and Katniss unsettlingly looked on, they noticed that Grayling had jumped out from behind another stone to their right, and she was now running towards the platform as well. Even Connor was running to the platform from the opposite side of the arena to Katniss and Joanna, but as he ran, Ennius, who was still on the upper platform, threw a knife at Connor, which scraped his thigh and made him stumble. At this point, Enabaria was about to reach the platform, but Grayling threw a knife and it hit her arm. Enabaria then stood still and launched her spear, and as Grayling ran, it flew straight through her head and out the other side, which sounded another cannon immediately. Enabaria continued to the platform, but after noticing that Connor had already made it to the edge of the death drop, and Ennius was aiming a knife at her, Enabaria ran to the steps on her left, and Joanna ran across the floor towards her, whilst Katniss stayed put with her bow and 2 arrows at the ready. Ennius ran back into the upper tunnel so that he could descend to the floor of the theatre, and Connor tried to reach over to the platform, but he was also being extremely careful not to fall into the death drop below. Enabaria tried to ignore her arm injury as she proceeded to run up the steps from Joanna, but Joanna quickly caught up with Enabaria and swiped the axe at her. During this chaos, Katniss looked ready to shoot Connor with one of her arrows, but her attention was averted by Joanna and Enabaria, and she appeared to panic. Joanna tackled Enabaria onto the steps, and the axe fell to the floor. However, Enabaria immediately turned around and tried to bite Joanna's neck. Katniss, who was intently watching this fight, quickly fired her arrow, and it hit Enabaria's neck. This made her back away from Joanna and yelp out in pain, but this gave Joanna enough time to pick up the axe, and she quickly sliced it through Enabaria's neck. As Enabaria's head proceeded to tumble down the steps and Joanna was temporarily left in shock, another cannon sounded. During this fight, Connor had been trying to use his sword to reach the white pill-like object that was on the platform, so that he did not risk falling into the pit below. Yet he failed to notice that Ennius had already come out of the nearest tunnel, and was now advancing towards him. Joanna and Katniss exchanged looks when they realized what was about to happen to Connor, and just as he finally turned around, Ennius ran his sword straight through Connor's stomach. Connor immediately spat out blood and looked aghast as he tried grabbing onto Ennius's shirt. Joanna, who had been watching this, launched her axe at Ennius, but he quickly turned Connor's body, which was hit by the axe instead. Katniss immediately fired her remaining arrow as well, but Ennius quickly ducked and therefore avoided this arrow. Katniss and Joanna exchanged frantic looks across the floor of the theatre, before simultaneously screaming and sprinting towards Ennius. He quickly dropped Connor's body into the death drop, and as the cannon sounded, he threw 2 of his knives, one towards Joanna, and then the other towards Katniss. The first knife hit Joanna directly in her brain, and she immediately collapsed. The second knife grazed the side of Katniss's head, but she continued to run forward. As Joanna's cannon sounded, Katniss jumped over the death drop with her remaining knife at the ready, but just as she landed, Ennius threw his final knife, and it hit Katniss in the heart. Katniss dropped to the floor and desperately tried to get back up, but her fate seemed to already be sealed. Ennius then grabbed his sword and brought it down through Katniss's back, which sounded her cannon just seconds later. There was a rare silence in the arena for the next few seconds, and Ennius leaned over to the platform that contained the small white object. He then brought it closer, and viewers realized that instead of being a pill, like they and most of the other tributes had thought, it was actually just a mint. Ennius proceeded to laugh as he realized this, and then swallowed the mint, just as it was announced in the arena that Ennius Dalton was the victor of the 76th Hunger Games. As the hovercraft lowered itself into the amphitheater in order to collect him, he cheered out heroically, and raised his arms in triumph. Every capital citizen in Snow Square was on their feet and applauding Ennius's brave performance throughout the games. After several minutes more of applause, he eventually climbed onto the hovercraft and was transported back to the accommodation quarters, where he received a hero's welcome. For the victor's interview, Ennius had his head shaved, and he was adorned in a slick silver suit, which made him appear even more muscular. Eugenia wore a neon gown and fascinators, both of teal, lemon, and fuchsia shades, that perfectly matched the colours of the snakes from the arena. Ennius made an even greater impression during this interview, where he spoke to Eugenia with a strong enthusiasm about his time in the arena and the kills that he had committed. Within weeks of the game's conclusion, the training academies of Districts 1 and 2 were relaunched due to popular demand. Although Ennius was extremely popular amongst capital circles, even gaining the nickname Son of Panem, he eventually returned to District 2, where he became a director of the training academy for several years. In the year 101, Ennius returned to the capital in order to take on the position of Master of Training, following Donald Crane's retirement. Shortly after taking on this role, he met his wife, Aura Jasper, with whom he went on to have 2 daughters, Flavia and Claudia, as well as a son, Septimus. Although many were skeptical about whether these games would be a success, the popularity of these games, especially amongst capital citizens, practically guaranteed that they would continue far into the future, which they did indeed. As we often say, Panem today, Panem tomorrow, Panem forever. So that was the Reclamation games. Feel free to let me know what you thought in the comments. I am sure you will. As usual, I would like to thank all my Patreons for their support, including my new Patreons, Joe, Connor, and Beth. I'm also going to give a shout out to Alexis Leader. I pronounced her name wrong earlier, apologies for that. She's created an album based on this ballad of songbirds and snakes. Feel free to check her link in the description and pinned comment. Also, thanks once again to Andrew McLean for the art that he has created. I'd recommend checking his link that will be in the description and pinned comment as well. Now, regarding the capital games, thank you for all your great comments. It was one of my favourites to write, so I'm glad people enjoyed. The polls below have produced some interesting results so far, although what really surprised me was the desired romance between Corio and Raskus. I'm not really sure where that came from, but each to their own. As for other questions, some people have stated that District 3 is not electricity and that District 5 is electricity instead. To this I say that District 3 produces technology of which the vast majority uses electricity, and District 5 does not just produce electricity, but produces other forms of power, like with the dam that we see being blown up in Mockingjay. I did think of raining microwaves for District 3's hazard, but this might be a bit strange even for Hunger Games standards. This leads me to my next point, where people were asking about District 5 and 11's unfeatured hazards and what they would have been. So, District 5, first of all, my favourite district. I was going to make that some kind of sonic surge. This would be similar to the one that was used in Cecilia's game, for example. This would not be big enough to blow someone's brain out of their head, but it would last a minute, and during that time probably knock tributes to the floor, and give them a headache for about an hour afterwards. Now, the other tributes who'd press the button during that time would probably be able to go and take advantage of these tributes at that time and kill them from there. But this was not included due to time constraints. District 11, that was one of the hardest ones to come up with, might have been why I didn't include it. But I think seeing as they produce lots of fruit, things like that, to do with agriculture, I might have made fruit appear in the cornucopia, and then it would have, yep, you guessed it, been poisonous. The final thing, the Heavensby issue. There are probably many Heavensby families. We've seen the surname goes back for a while, so there are probably plenty. Although MacLean Heavensby would not have been Plutarch Heavensby's son, he could have been someone else's son. So that's my answer to that question. Anyway, I hope you enjoy and look forward to seeing you all again next week.